Now, this red menace that's propagated by the military, industrial, governmental, and media complex, that's what I call it, serves the function of telling people that it's worse anywhere else. One of the first things you will hear is, where is it any better? The Soviets have it worse. If you go around and lecture, I'm dealing with the subject right now, but generally I might talk about Reaganomics. Talk about any subject. Almost the first question you get is, talk about the Russians. What about them? It's worse there. It's worse there. So why criticize here? And you could say, maybe it is worse there. And by the way, I don't think that the evidence indicates that in terms of economic conditions. But maybe it is worse there. What the hell's that got to do with you here? I mean, if you had abuses and problems here at University of Massachusetts, would someone get up and say, it's worse at the University of New Hampshire? Which it probably is. But what are you supposed to say to that? You're supposed to go, oh, that's okay then. Oh, then let them double my tuition because they're tripling it in New Hampshire. Oh, that's all right. Oh, then we shouldn't complain. Oh, it's worse there. But that's the first, I tell you, man, you can go anywhere in the country now. That's the first question that'll come up. Where do you think it's any better? Now, I think it's better in Cuba, where I injured my leg, a very serious injury, my Achilles tendon, and I went to a hospital, and I got an operation, and nobody gave me that examination you get in the U.S., the first examination you get when you go into an emergency clinic, and you can be bleeding from 3 places, the examination of your wallet, to see if you got medical coverage, and if you don't, you're sent to another hospital, you're dumped on the public hospital, which may be across town while you're still bleeding. It was better in Cuba where I got that operation, and I didn't have to pay a penny, and I came back here with a cast, and I tried to get an orthopedic doctor, and I couldn't, and I could pay. I said, I'll pay. You don't understand, I'll pay. And they said, oh, we know you'll pay. We don't take any other kind of patient. But they're all booked, and I finally got some guy who just come out of medical school, and I hobbled into his office, and he looked at the cast, and he said, leave it on another week. That's $50. I can tell you that $50. I never resented paying $50 so much. It was better in Cuba. In a poor country, I got good medical care. In a rich country, I'm treated like a beggar and a pariah. It was better in Cuba, where I didn't see any kids with swollen bellies and hungry and begging. I didn't see any people begging. It was better in Cuba than it was in Washington, D.C., where I live, and I walk down the street and I see people in total misery and disorientation standing there begging for food, begging for money, sleeping in hallways. I see that in the richest country in the world. That's where it was better. And when you talk about freedom, that's freedom. And when you talk about oppression, that's oppression. Sleeping in a doorway is oppression. You want to know what oppression is? Then sleep in the doorways of the land of the free and the home of the brave, and you'll know what oppression is. You want to know what oppression is? Then think about the guys who sit there wondering if they're going to blow their brains out because they can't pay the mortgage on their house and they can't feed their kids and they see the whole thing falling apart. That's where it's better. And those are real things, and that's part of freedom. Now, the military, no, you don't have to. The red menace that's propaganda, though, tries to direct popular discontent. Don't think you got it bad because it's worse over there, you see. And also, there's a menace out there. And don't make too much waves here. We are in very serious times. What does Reagan do in his 6 years? What has he been doing? He has been distracting people from the real issues of their lives. He has refused to talk about human services, about underemployment, about the crises of the cities, except occasionally to make a little quip, like the other night where he talked about some guy who was living in a $36,000 rental in a welfare hotel. And saying, that sounds pretty good to me, not pointing out that the price was a rip-off on the government, which he should have been looking at, and the guy was living in a cramped, crowded, dirty little room in that hotel because no one else would take him anywhere else. And for all those years, what has he been doing? He's been telling you about Gaddafi, and terrorism, and the Soviet menace, and the evil empire, and our defenses, and this and that, and out there and over there. Rally around the flag, forget the realities of your own life. And this is what the ruling elites have to do. They have to continually, strenuously bring us back to the fantasies of their world, because the people keep floating off into reality. And that's a problem for them. The people keep floating off concerned about jobs and homes and the education of their kids and their medical bills and that sort of thing. And so that's what he's been doing. And that red menace is very important for that function. It is very functional.
Many people don't realize it, but most of Eastern Europe before World War II, and certainly after World War II, given the additional destruction, most of Eastern Europe was a third world region. Thousands of villages were reduced to rubble. Illiteracy, poverty, disease, coal, hunger was the common lot among the peasantry and much of the working class, as it was before the war. Capital formation was almost non-existent. The same was true of pre-revolutionary Russia. The same was true of pre-revolutionary China. Henry Rosemont, he notes that when the communists liberated Shanghai from the U.S.-sponsored Kuomintang reactionary government in 1949, the communists found that about 20% of the population in Shanghai, 1.2 million people, were drug addicts. And every morning, special crews of street cleaners, quote, would gather up the corpses of children and adults who had been murdered during the night or died of disease, cold, and starvation. Communism, ladies and gentlemen, I say it without flinching, communism in Eastern Europe, Russia, China, Mongolia, North Korea, and Cuba brought land reform and human services, a dramatic bettering of the living conditions of hundreds of millions of people on a scale never before or never since witnessed in human history. And that's something to appreciate. Communism transformed desperately poor countries into societies in which everyone had adequate food, shelter, medical care, and education. And some of us who come from poor families, who carry around the hidden injuries of class, are very impressed, are very, very impressed by these achievements and are not willing to dismiss them as economistic. To say that socialism doesn't work is to overlook the fact that it did work, and it worked for hundreds of millions of people. But what about the democratic rights that they lost? We hear U.S. leaders talking about restoring democracy to the communist countries. But these countries, with the exception of Czechoslovakia, were not democracies before communism. Russia was a czarist autocracy. Poland was a right-wing fascist dictatorship under Pilsudski with concentration camps of its own. Albania was an Italian fascist protectorate as early as 1927. Cuba was a U.S.-sponsored dictatorship under that butcher Batista. Lithuania, Hungary, Romania, and Bulgaria were outright fascist regimes, openly allied with Nazi Germany in World War II. So what democracy are we talking about restoring? The socialist countries did not take away any rights that didn't exist there in the first place. Now, all of this is not to deny that communist countries suffered internal deficiencies and contradictions that were real factors in their own demise. I'm not trying to blame it. I don't want to blame it all on capitalist encirclement. Oh, if it wasn't capitalist.
If this audience wanted to get a better understanding of, say, your vision of a better America, how useful would it be to this audience to look at the Soviet Union today? In other words, how exact of a model is the Soviet Union for America?
Well, the Soviet Union couldn't be an exact model for us. It has a whole different tradition, history. It's had a very unluxurious history. It's had a very difficult, terrible, horrendous history. So we couldn't use it as a model. We have a different level of prosperity. What I would say is this. You could look at any existing socialist country. If you don't want to call them socialist, call them whatever you want. Post-capitalist, whatever. I don't care. Call them camels, window shades. Doesn't matter. As long as you know the countries we're talking about. You can look at any one of those countries, and you can evaluate them in several ways. One, comparing them to what they had before. And that, to me, is what's very compelling. That's what's so compelling about Cuba, for instance. When I was in Cuba, I was up in the Escambray, which is like the Appalachia of Cuba, very rugged mountains, people very poor they were. And I said to this campesino, I said, "Do you like Fidel?" And he says, "Sí, sí, with all our souls." I remember his gesture, with all our souls. I said, "Why?" And he pointed to this clinic right up there on the hill, which we had visited. He said, look at that. He said, before the revolution, we never saw a doctor. If someone was seriously ill, it would take 20 people to carry that person, because you'd go day and night. It would take 2 days to get to the hospital. First, because it was far away, and second, because you couldn't go straight. You couldn't cross the latifundio lands. The boss would kill you. So you had to go like this. And often when we got to the hospital, the person might be dead by the time we got there. Now we have this clinic up here with a full-time doctor. And today, a doctor in Cuba, when you become a doctor, you've got to spend 2 years out in the country. That's your dedication to the people. And a dentist who comes 1 day a week. And for more serious things, we're not more than 20 minutes away from a larger hospital. That's in the Escambray. He said, that's freedom. We're freer today. We have more life. And I talked to a guy in Havana who says to me, before, all I used to see here in Havana, you call this drab and dull. We see it as a cleaner city. It's true, you got the paint is peeling off the walls, but you don't see kids begging in the streets anymore, and you don't see prostitutes. All we used to have was prostitutes. Prostitution used to be one of the biggest industries. And today, this man is going to night school. He said, I can read. I can read. Do you know what it means to be able to read? Do you know what it means to be able not to read? I remember when I gave my book to my father, I dedicated a book of mine, Power and the Powerless, to my father. I said, to my father with my love. Gave him a copy of the book. He opened it up, looked at that. He'd only gone to the 7th grade. He was a son of an immigrant, a working-class Italian. And he opens the book, and he starts looking through it, and he gets misty-eyed, very misty-eyed. And I thought it was because he was so touched that his son had dedicated a book to him. That wasn't the reason. He looks up to me and says, I can't read this, kid. I said, that's okay, Dad. Neither can the students. I mean, that's not something... I mean, don't worry about that. I wrote it for you. I mean, it's your book, and you don't have to read it. You know, it's a very complicated book, academic book. He says, yeah, I can't read this book. And the defeat that man felt. That's what illiteracy is about. That's what the joy of literacy programs is. That's why in Nicaragua you got people walking proud now for the first time. They were animals before. They weren't allowed to read. They weren't taught to read. So you compare a country to what it came from, with all its imperfections, and those who demand instant perfection. The day after the revolution, they get up and say, are there civil liberties for the fascists? Are they going to be allowed to have their newspapers and their radio program? Are they going to be able to keep all their farms? The passion that some of our liberals feel, the day after the revolution, the passion and concern they feel for the fascists, the civil rights and civil liberties of those fascists who were dumping and destroying and murdering people before. Now the revolution has got to be perfect. It's got to be flawless. Well, that isn't my criteria. My criteria is what happens to those people who couldn't read. What happens to those babies that couldn't eat, that died of hunger? And that's why I support revolution. The revolution that feeds the children gets my support. Not blindly, not unqualifiedly.
Now, why is the U.S. national security state involved in acts of destabilization, sabotage, propaganda, terror, drug trafficking, torture, and death squads in Latin America, Asia, Africa, and Europe? Why is it now suddenly so impelled by humanitarian concerns for the Albanians in Kosovo? Is that why we're in Yugoslavia? Is it humanitarian compassion that compels U.S. forces to have bombed 4 countries in the last 6 months? Is it humanitarian concern that the U.S. is involved in proxy wars in Angola, Colombia, and various other countries? If it's oppressed minorities U.S. leaders are worried about, why doesn't Clinton bomb the Turkish people for what their leaders have been doing to the Kurds? Why doesn't he... I mean, it would be crazy and irrational to bomb people in Turkey, to bomb the ordinary people because of what they're doing. But that's what we're doing. That's what is happening in Yugoslavia. Why don't we bomb the Indonesians for killing over 200, because their generals killed over 200,000 East Timorese? What about bombing Israel for what it's done to the Palestinians? What about bombing the Czech Republic for the way it has mistreated the Romani, or called gypsies here in our country? What about bombing the Guatemalan people? Let's go bomb Guatemala City for the systematic slaughter of tens of thousands of Mayan villagers all over Guatemala. In fact, the U.S. wouldn't ever think of bombing them. The U.S., in most of those cases, Turkey, Indonesia, Guatemala, gave them aid, gave them guns, gave them training, is totally complicit with those horrible atrocities. Why doesn't he bomb Great Britain for oppressing the Catholic minority in Northern Ireland? Go bomb his girlfriend, Tony Blair. Tony Blair is Bill Clinton in drag. Look closely at him. Why doesn't he bomb the Hutu for the mass murder of 500,000 Tutsis in Rwanda, and bomb the French imperialist force that went in and was totally complicit in that massacre? In fact, Bill Clinton didn't even want to discuss it. He didn't even want to apply the name genocide to that. He didn't want to get into it because he liked the stopping of the Tutsi Liberation Army. They had a scent of column B about them. And while Clinton is at it, why doesn't he bomb himself for the treatment of Native American Indians, African Americans, and working people in general?
So one of the laws of capitalist motion and development is this inexorable expansion. And that means expansion into an expropriation of the third world. A process that's been going on for about 400 years. Perpetrated by the Portuguese, the Spaniards, the Dutch, the Belgians, the French, the English, and most recently, most successfully, most impressively, by the Americans. That is by the ruling classes of these countries, not by the ordinary people. The ordinary people simply paid the costs of empire. The ordinary people simply sent their sons off to die on the plains of India or in the jungles of the Congo or in Latin America, wherever else. But that expropriation of the third world has been going on for 400 years, brings us to another revelation, namely that the third world is not poor. You don't go to poor countries to make money. There are very few poor countries in this world. Most countries are rich. The Philippines are rich. Brazil is rich. Mexico is rich. Chile is rich. Only the people are poor. But there's billions to be made there, to be carved out and to be taken. There's been billions for 400 years. The capitalist European and North American powers have carved out and taken the timber, the flax, the hemp, the cocoa, the rum, the tin, the copper, the iron, the rubber, the bauxite, the slaves, and the cheap labor. They have taken out of these countries. These countries are not underdeveloped, they're overexploited. One of the countries that had a great deal of Western capital in it was Tsarist Russia. Mostly English, French, some German, some American, including one Herbert Hoover, who with Leslie Urquhart, famous British millionaire, owned the Russo-Asiatic Corporation, which, if the Russian Revolution hadn't happened, Herbert Hoover would have been one of the richest men in the world. And years later, when he was President of the United States, in 1931, when 1/3 of this country was unemployed, when people didn't have enough to eat, when people were driven to the edge of desperation, President Herbert Hoover said to the San Francisco Examiner, he said, "My greatest ambition in life is to see the overthrow of Bolshevism in Russia." There came, with the Russian Revolution, a break in the fabric of international capitalist history. There now was a country where the unwashed, where the workers of Petrograd and Moscow were actually taking over, where they were actually taking over the land, the labor, the technology, and the resources of their country, where communists were coming in to power. And there's a remarkable correspondence between Secretary of State Lansing and President Woodrow Wilson, in which Lansing says, the Bolsheviks are wanting in political virtue. They would preach to the ordinary man that he might elevate himself through political means rather than by dint of hard work. This would be a most unfortunate example to the common man in our country and other countries. They understood what was the threat. The Americans themselves, the American ruling class, had very little didn't have all that much. I told you about Hoover and a few other speculators, other people like that. But they joined in with 14 other nations to invade the Soviet Union, to overthrow the socialist government that had just been put in after the Tsar was overthrown. That process of invading a revolutionary country is still happening before our eyes. If you want to understand those years after the Russian Revolution, just look at what's going on in Nicaragua. Invasion, either by directly with troops from your own country, or by using surrogate troops, and they use the white armies and the white generals, the white guard armies. Embargoes, isolation, withholding food supplies, sabotage, encirclement, refusing diplomatic recognition. These are the methods that are used, and these are the methods, time-honored methods, that are being used right now by Reagan against another revolutionary government, which is Nicaragua.